job is not anything at all about showing a better way to live. It's about trying to determine what the hell is going on around us. It's not a matter of questioning or doubt or anarchy or any of these old-fashioned ideas. It's a matter of you have to determine what constitutes dignity for your own existence.
When you actually see birds flying in flocks in the air, when you see spiders instinctively spinning their webs, when you see flowers blooming in gardens, the scientific picture seems very two-dimensional. It seems to be leaving some essential feature of life out of the picture.
At this particular moment, the Tibetan teachings coming has actually added kind of like a new fire to the whole movement of spirituality. As you can see in the West, there has been a great influence of Tibetan Buddhism in art, in, for example, psychology, in philosophy, even among the scientists. So that's been a kind of a quite incredible thing.
Do you not think that we adopt, us Westerners, a very patronizing attitude towards the nations we call the third world, instead of putting our own countries in order first?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bon voyage.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
As a Tibetan scholar and spiritual founder of the Rigpa centers, Sogyal Rinpoche encourages his students to discover the relation between the form and the essence of their very actions. He says that it is creativity that bridges the gap between them. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake is best known for his concept of morphogenetic fields. If one takes the view that nature is alive rather than dead, that organisms have a kind of inherent memory, that the laws of nature are in fact more like habits, then one has a completely different view of reality. Working with language instead of using forms to transmit meaning, Lawrence Weiner became a representative of the conceptual art movement that developed in New York from the early 60s on. Lawrence Weiner's language structures define an area in which time passes as a continuum, and where reality doesn't define things and people, but rather the relationships between them.
Click. I've got it. And it was so.
The
biggest disaster is not so bad.
No, in fact, better to be a big disaster or a huge success than an in-between gloss. And that's true of careers, I've discovered, too.
No, that's true about everything. I mean, the whole point is that you can take this other turn of being an artist and be a métier de bourgeois. You either do something that genuinely could change the culture, or you just don't do anything. So I'm fascinated by rivers because of the changing stability of water. So I looked at these rivers, and they really are just slime. Europeans have treated their rivers just as badly as Americans have treated their rivers, and there's nobody walking away clean in this world any longer. And the Rhine is just one big cesspool. And it's sort of strange, so I did this series of drawings about heavy metals and materials' relationship to the Rhine, and the fact that they found Valium in the Rhine. I mean, that's heavy. I mean, it's not bad enough they put quicksilver, what is it, mercury, and other things. They found Valium in the Rhine. I mean, there are all these sad, depraved, middle-class housewives that now will be doing without the Valium that's been dumped in the Rhine.
I think there's a general and greater popular interest in biology because of the ecological and environmental problems. But at least in relation to Gaia, the living Earth, these things are closely related to physics, because ozone, the carbon dioxide effect, climatic changes are very much the physics side of what's going on. And I think what we're seeing really is that physics and biology are part of an integrated system of a living world in a living cosmos, whereas previously they were separated rather radically. I mean, biology is still, for the majority of its practitioners, is dealing with living machinery, still regarding animals and plants as mere machines, living in an inanimate world governed by physics. I think this shift towards the idea of a living world in which physics and biology are both aspects of the living Earth and the living cosmos is what's going on at the moment.
I was involved with anti-nuclear protests when I was young, and I continue to be. I don't see nuclear power as the answer. But I'm not against nuclear research, which is a complication. But everybody in the world now is quote-unquote green, but I don't see people that are green not using this tropical wood on their boats, and it's really a complicated issue. I'd like to deal with what it's about. Why are we doing this? Is there a certain kind of nihilism based into our structure that maybe this is normal? I'm not condoning it to any extent. When confronted by friends in the harbor here who have ships and are basically without direction, I constantly sort of ask them, because they have shippers' papers, why don't they take their ship instead of running around as a charter for board executives and join Greenpeace as a fleet? It's a decent life, and for a sailor it's an ideal life. You're doing something. But at the same time, I don't know what is causing us to do all this stuff. I don't really know why we have this rushing need to embrace entropy. Artists like Robert Smithson had tried to deal with the fact of entropy itself as a material. I use entropy in the work that I'm doing. There's an ever-changing state of the materials. The relationship is basic, but its subjective attitude, its frills, the way that you see it, its mode, is not at all an objective thing, because it's constantly involved in entropy.
We all have Buddha nature. Each and every one of us has Buddha nature. That Buddha nature, all this life and death are a process of evolution towards the enlightenment. That when we, for example, are true to our Buddha nature, we progress. When we, for example, live in an unwholesome way, and then we retard our kind of transmigration. And so, you see, I think it's very important to have this overall vision, because one thing you see with us, even though Western world is extremely practical, we have all kinds of insurances, you know, all kinds of insurance for every possible thing, but we've ignored one big thing: death and the eternity. Because you see how long we will live, at the most 100 years, and after that there's a whole eternity. Maybe people say, I don't believe in life after, but that's fine. Because in reality, you see, when you die, belief has got nothing to do with it, you see. I always tease people and say, what if you were to die and you find there is life after, what you're going to do? So you see, we have to have a little bit of a, how do you say, benefit of doubt, that there might be life after. Because otherwise, sometimes if there is no life after, I mean, there is not so much meaning, you know. Especially when young children die, or when we die in the middle of our work, or something like we die, and there's really no meaning. Because if you were to really die, if that was it, there's no meaning. And life is not like just an old television set which just goes off. Not like that. There is some continuity that happens. But in this, how we live in this life is what really brings about a future. As Buddha said, what you are is what you have been, and what you will be is what you do now.
The question I'm dealing with is the question of how form and order come into being in living organisms, and indeed in nature as a whole. The problem is to understand how a small egg grows into a complete organism, such as ourselves, or how an acorn grows into an oak tree. The standard view is that this is because there are chemical genes that program that development. But many developmental biologists have felt that's an inadequate view, because all the cells have the same genes, and so something else must tell the genes what to do. The genes alone won't explain this process. There's an idea that's been around for at least 60 years, the idea of form-shaping fields, morphogenetic fields. And this idea of invisible fields which shape and guide the development of organisms is the starting point for my own ideas. What I'm saying, in effect, is that the form and the instincts of organisms are inherited as a kind of collective memory from past members of their species, and that this inheritance is not going through the genes, but is a non-material kind of memory. They tune in directly to past members of the species.
And you're the reincarnate of the master of the 13th Dalai Lama?
Yes, I'm supposed to be. I think it's this is something that is very unique to Tibet. Even though it doesn't mean that such kind of reincarnations do not exist all over the world. They do, but Tibet was one society where it was kind of officially accepted. So in many ways this very great master, who I'm really not really, only thing I have is his blessing. In some ways I'm like he's a little bit of his instrument to continue his work.
The idea of morphic resonance, the basis of the memory process I'm talking about, says that each species has a kind of collective memory on which all members of the species draw and to which all members of the species contribute.
When the right conditions come about, there comes a moment that the incarnation suddenly remembers the wisdom of the past, the teachings of the past. So therefore he or she doesn't have to study very much, can discover the teachings more quickly. So it's like the continuing of the wisdom.
It may be possible, I suppose, to tune into the memories of some particular person who's now dead and gain access to their memories. There is indeed some evidence that young children occasionally can remember, apparently, episodes from previous lives. Now, if they can remember things from previous lives, it could be that they're just tapping into those people's memories. It needn't necessarily prove that they are those people reincarnated. So I think this idea of morphic resonance enables us to understand that people could perhaps have memories of previous lives. It wouldn't necessarily prove that they are those people. That would depend on how you define a person, and that would lead into a whole area of philosophical debate.
I find the research of Sheldrake one of the most interesting things biologically that I've come across, because it also fits in completely with the Lamarckian theory that if you can in some way, manner or form enhance the quality of life of the human being, that quality of life's enhancement will pass on to the next aspiration. And also the end of the ivory tower concept, where if you are a scientist or an artist and you are sitting in your studio, which is what we do most of our lives, and you do push something to a point where you are confronting a reality that's different than a reality that you previously had, that this in some way adds to the genetic morphology of the world, that somehow or other you have changed the ontology of the world, that somebody then in Bangkok or in New Delhi or in Paris can basically come up with the same thing. I don't know how it works, and I want to believe, Rupert Sheldrake, that it works. So when you have a fantasy of what a beautiful woman is, you essentially have to have a fantasy when you ask about a vision of the world. You have to have a fantasy about how that develops itself, because if you fall in love with the absolute personification at that moment of a human being, they're not the same the next day. Then you've fallen in love with nothing but a fantasy. And that's the same with materials. You begin to, the thing that I do with materials and try to approximate when in presentation, because what you see me doing when you're taking your films and all is not what I do, it's what I do in order to be able to present to you what I do. And that's to understand the essential relationships of one material to another material. With that understanding, the enrichment does not require a metaphor. It requires an acceptance of the system of that understanding to translate it into your daily life. Art is fine. Art is a necessity to understand who we are, what we are, where we come from. But that existential question is not the reason for the existence of art. The reason for the existence of art is that it's an objective reality, and therefore it allows itself to be used as a metaphor by any person basically needing it, because it is essentially about a relationship to a material. And entropy is part and inherent structure. The inherent structure of all material is entropic.
I got involved with this project at a very early stage. I don't know whether you know this or not. It was Robert Filliou, who was a friend of mine, and Louwrien. And it was actually Robert Filliou who encouraged me to meet with the artist. You know, I met with Joseph Beuys, we had an interview together. In some ways, this new awakening that has taken place in the West of spiritual, to the spiritual teachings, in some ways been influenced by the artists. As you know, like the Allen Ginsberg and other poets and so on. And then you see their kind of, because they have the people with kind of special mind, who were perhaps were very special beings who were frustrated with what was going on in the world. And they begin to express their frustration. They're searching. In their search, their kind of search, in a sense, kind of began to catch the imagination of the people. I've had a very interesting life, being born in Tibet and raised in a monastery. And then, you know, we had a tragic situation. We had to leave our country. I tell people we didn't come here as missionaries. We were just thrown out. And as such, been through a lot of changes, really. I think something to be able to consider as impermanence and death. It happened in my life so many times. I've been through a hell of a lot. I'm not just a lama. I've been through a lot in my life. And that I've always felt coming to the West. By the way, I went to a Catholic school. Then I went to England to study in Church of England in Trinity College. I studied theology. God forbid. For me, you see, coming from a monastic situation into a kind of completely kind of so-called a real world has been such a profound teaching for me. And I really learned very deeply. And what was extraordinary for me was that many of the things that I learned in the monasteries, which were kind of like we knew the concept of it, but when you begin to actually come into life as a whole, in the Western life, it begins to really, the truth of it begins to reveal itself. So in some ways, like my own understanding of Buddhism deepened in coming to the West, and it really inspired me.
I got interested in the idea of morphogenetic fields from the existing studies of development in the biological sciences. And the idea that there's a kind of inherent memory in them came to me in a flash. And I saw that this might be the answer to understanding how organisms develop and evolve. And indeed, I later saw that this would apply to all nature. So the idea of evolving habits of nature instead of fixed mathematical laws which were all there before the Big Bang seemed to me a more reasonable way of thinking of an evolving universe.
I think generally, you see, what we do is the mind has two positions. We look outwardly or look inwardly. Is this clear? Often when you say we're studying the mind, or when you do research into the mind, we're not looking at the mind, we're looking at the projections and the risings of the mind. But when you practice, what you do, you bring your mind home, here. Mind into the mind. And it's a rest.
I think the key thing to recognize is that consciousness is one aspect of our mind, the part we're conscious of, but there's a large part of our mental activity, the unconscious mind, which we're not conscious of. And I think that something like the unconscious mind is operating throughout the natural realm. The fields I'm talking about, the morphic fields which organize the development of plants and animals, I think largely work unconsciously, habitually. They're much more like our unconscious minds than like our conscious minds. So I think people get confused sometimes when they want to say nature isn't just a mechanism, therefore it must have consciousness in it. There's a level between mechanism and consciousness, which is that of unconscious soul or unconscious habit, or the realm I think is organized by morphic fields. So I think that animals and plants are purposive, but I don't think their purposes are conscious for the most part. I think they're unconscious purposes. And just as our own unconscious minds are purposive, but we're not conscious of their purposes or their activity most of the time.
So you see, when you live in a place where there's always cloudy, you don't really see the other reality. That's what we are. We are always in the domain of our ordinary mind, where there's confusion and so on, so on, so on, so on. So we need to take a plane But once we go beyond the clouds, you see there is an infinite space, almost the spaciousness of sky that allows the clouds to be. You know, it's like a compassion to view even your confusion, even your negativity, all your different aspects just as the sky views, as ocean views its waves. That is the attitude of meditation. That is the attitude of spiritual practice, of this generosity to yourself. And I often use the example like oneself, the meditator or the spiritual practitioner, it'd be like a charming hostess or host. And all your difficult thoughts are like really difficult guests. You know, the thing is to just be charming or just to give, to let go, to let go. Often people think meditation is technique. It's not technique, it's attitude.
All of us are creatures of habit. We build up our own habits. We inherit cultural habits. I mean, for example, in our languages, we inherit the whole vocabulary. I mean, I haven't invented the English language. I've inherited it as a going concern. And the vast majority of words in it were already there when I was born, and more have been added since, but they're added quite slowly. And the basic habits, the metaphors, the implicit cultural understanding that goes with the language is a habit you inherit. So most of us inherit cultural habits. We build up our own personal habits. We have social habits. And our creativity happens against a huge background of habit. Creativity is always working against a background of habit. And if the creativity is successful, if it's useful or something that takes root and is repeated, then habits are something that grow out of creativity.
An observation that the artist as a person chose to spend their time studying or looking at the relationships of human beings to objects and objects to objects in relation to human being, and then that observation is presented, and that essentially is what art is. It can't change your life. It could destroy some of your dreams. What we are talking about is essentially how to build an economy, or to build a social system, or to build something that will hang in a non-symmetrical pattern, that will have a temporal unity, which is useful for our times, that is not using history in any way, manner, or form as an affirmative value judgment. And that's basically why I accepted the invitation, and that's why I'm here, is to try to figure out a way to raise a temporal unity, a temporal balance that is not based on Aristotelian principles, that does not accept the concepts as we know them and as our parents have told us of good and evil, that does not accept the consequences of the value of what a material is.
I am always dependent from many others. And it's probably one of the great strengths of the artists. They are independent. And I think it is a great luck for you, and it is a great achievement for a man to be completely independent. But I think that people like me and like all the people who are involved in economic life, they have not only the responsibility of behaving themselves correctly, and it's very difficult to know what means correctly, but also they keep in mind constantly the responsibility they have vis-à-vis the others.
When you work with yourself, that's what the spiritual practices are good is working with yourself so that you come back to your fundamental human nature. Fundamental, you see? And from that state, you become more responsible, because then you remember your responsibility for others. Because if all your different aspects were dominant, you know, other aspects, your negative aspects, I don't know, are dominant, then we become, even though we are supposed to be responsible, we don't become so responsible.
We have a tendency, and we've been doing this and extrapolating this into our conversations from the very beginning, to say that what somehow or other some people in the audience considers good behavior or responsible behavior is, quote unquote, the fundamental human creature. Now, I don't know where this all comes from. The fundamental human creature is every single fundamental human creature. What we're talking about essentially is when we say, why doesn't the business community become more spiritual? Why doesn't the business community do more, open itself up more? Quote unquote, I cringe when I hear the word generosity. Nobody in this world should be generous. All people should be altruistic, because essentially, if there is any ideal that we're talking about, that is something that if you can satisfy yourself, you essentially will be satisfying the needs of other people. But I don't know. Obviously, I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm not even a responsible adult most of the time.
If we have constructed a structure that isn't working, like we say communist society was invented, it was command economy, it didn't work, it patently didn't work, it didn't feed the people, do we then find ourselves another structure which is better?
Who said that Marxist economy did not work in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union survived for 45 years after the Second World War, which was complete devastation. It worked. It just wasn't satisfying whatever the desires of the changing culture within the Soviet Union at that time was. It functioned.
Modern economy is based on liberal capitalism, and it's not at all an utopia, which by chance has proved to be successfully implemented. It is, on the contrary, the product of the creativity, the personal creativity of hundreds of millions of people through the history and all around the world, and it continues and it will evolve. It's absolutely unavoidable. But what I mean, it is that this system, which works very well and which finally makes life easier, makes us able to sit together with light, with transportation and so on. We are able to solve many problems for the short time to come. We are probably able to solve problems for longer term, but until now we do not know yet where we are going to in the long run.
But I think that, for instance, in Europe we have become too rich. We should stop getting more commodities and so on, because this is not what makes people happy.
So if we then say enough is enough, we don't need any more, how do we reach the point where everyone can say that? So far all we've achieved is some have got too much, a few, probably a great many have enough, a great many more simply haven't got enough.
Find something within the cultures that don't have enough, that you want. That's not necessarily a prime resource, that doesn't eat up their life and doesn't eat up their time. Find something that you find value to that you never gave a value to before. It could even be a song. And I don't mean to sound idealistic, but you have to find new things within these other places that we've excluded all these years from participating in our rich life. Find something they've got that is of a value to us that does not fuck up their whole life. My major problem is the fact that we cannot figure out why we're giving this money to other places besides the fact of how wonderful we are. Well, we ain't wonderful. We didn't get the money in a wonderful way. And if we don't find some way, manner, or form to give a dignity, a value of function to these other people, it's going to go on forever.
To proceed in planning the economy on the basis of one-year short-term balance sheets of companies is obviously stupid, but it's obviously stupid already. To destroy millions of years of evolution in cutting down rainforests so that they can produce short-term gains for cattle barons over a few years. And it looks good on their balance sheets and on their books, but if you had some kind of global bookkeeping, then this loss of biological diversity, the loss of these forests would... But it doesn't show up as an asset, you see. There's no way of quantifying the money value of the Amazonian tropics and of all the thousands of species that are there. I think there'd have to be a way of developing a new kind of economics. I don't think we can go along with the old kind of economics and have these new ideas make much sense.
If we could deal with these questions of hunger and poverty, not in political questions, but in a very simple question of give and take, you'd have to find something that they had that you wanted. And it can't be the European model of going on holiday and turning people into servants, and that's how you help their economy. People who are capable of stopping what they're doing in order to spend so-called the 1 month or the 2 months to become more human or to have family values usually die earlier from heart attacks, and they're not very good for their company either, because you're supposed to like what you do, and if you don't, you're supposed to change it.
He disregarded a certain number of exchanges which are taking place. We must not exclude anything. We must, on the contrary, add year by year, day by day, new exchanges with them.
Then let me pose something that, again, might sound extremely romantic, but as an artist, it's not at all. It's the inequity that artists have within the so-called business community and within the so-called academic industry, is that when an artist does something, this is used then to give employment to people in museums. It's used to give employment to professors, to students, to industry steals it like mad, and nobody gets anything. And if they didn't think they were going to get something out of it and they're sitting in that audience, they're fools. That's what they're there for.
And what do you think they might get out of it?
What do you think they might get out of it? Fortunes are made by realizing that the perceptions of an object, the perceptions of a material have changed within a particular society. That's how fortunes are made in a capitalist society. They built rules that make them live within a society that doesn't allow them to think certain things. They're going to be confronted by a situation where people get paid to think what they're not supposed to think. People get paid to take that chance of dropping into madness. They can't do it. They can't even have an opinion about what a new cut of skirt looks like. It all depends upon who it's on, not what it is. A very great American writer, Paul Bowles, spent the majority of his adult life in North Africa collecting Berber stories and collecting many, many stories of the region. Those stories, when published, of course, he would share with whoever was telling him the story and things. We can, in a sense, change our value structure. What is it that we get from being alive? Not as an antique, not as a living relic, because all the stories we find are all stories about transitions within their culture. And transition is a modernist movement. It continues on.
May I say something
Please.
here? Is that when I was in Cambridge studying comparative religions, which was mainly Anglican theology, I had to study a lot of these reports of Christian missionaries who went and decided what each religion was. Actually, the professors were quite embarrassed to bring that to me, or apologetically saying, now it's all changed, but however, we have to study them. I think what is fundamentally important is that sometimes what happens is that the West has a kind of a rather, how do you say, rather, if I may use the word very directly, arrogance. That's why also the danger is now, for example, when we bring democratic and the Western models to other cultures, it somehow doesn't fit. That's a problem that the Tibetans are going to face now. Is that His Holiness Dalai Lama wants to very much bring about the democratization, but the democracy as exists in the West was not going to be applicable to the kind of the nature of the Tibetans.
If we don't give them things because we don't want to give them charity, are we not equally insulting them by trying to use them or their things, their artifacts, or their culture?
They're not insulting you by asking for your technology, and they're willing to trade for it, but they're willing to trade resources that we don't need any longer. They're willing to trade raw materials which are devastating their countries, and they're willing to trade other things. But they're not demeaning you by saying, hey, you know how to do that, you tell me how to do that, I know how to do this, I want to do it, but I don't want another truck, I want something else.
Yep. there is a lot of myth about the Western man, Western people, you know. Do you know what I'm saying? The colonials have left some kind of a, little bit of inferiority complex with the countries, and there is a really respect. On one way, they don't want the Westerners in certain countries, but another way, they respect very much. Indians working together don't work it out, or, you know, that's just an example. A Western person from there moves the initiative, and then suddenly happens there. Do you know what I'm saying? So that, in a sense, there is the areas where actually the people from the West can contribute tremendously to the betterment of the culture there, which are dying in many ways.
There are a number of countries in the world which have committed what is tantamount to national suicide themselves. And I would like to point out, in addition to the example of China under Mao in the late 60s, Burma, which is inherently a very wealthy country, which has ruined itself. Argentina, which at the turn of the century was an extraordinarily rich country, which has gone right down the drain. The current president is trying to rescue them. And the Sudan, where I had personal experience in 1984 and 1985, the Sudan is potentially richer than Saudi Arabia. It has oil, it has very rich agricultural land, it has gold and other resources, but due to civil war, everything is absolutely stopped, and the incredible inertia which the Sudanese are brilliant at just cannot be overcome.
I just don't think we've worked out ways of bridging how these new ideas would fit with the corporate world. Obviously, one ideal which is already perfectly apparent to many people is that the development of the Earth should be sustainable. We should think not just 3 years ahead or 5 years ahead, but 100 or 200 years ahead. And when we do that, I think we'd see a very different way of planning what we do. But most people don't want to, or haven't wanted to think so far ahead, and it'll involve a whole new change of perspective, a whole new way of thinking. But I think many of these changes that are needed can be seen right now, even before science gets around to changing its view of the world. I mean, there's a new scientific worldview emerging, but I think, in a sense, the ecological and the environmental problems are leading rather than following the change in worldview in science. I think it's the general social and economic problems that we're in that are making us more ready to think about challenging the basis of our scientific ideas.
We go from a product industry to a service industry. For the products, we had this material development, and we've brought it very far. But for the service industry, we need mental development. And this is, I think, something that other cultures can provide us with. I would think, get the best from the Indians, the Tibetans, the Aborigines, wherever. Get the best and work with it.
The business community here knows that ideas are as much a commodity as a piece of steel. There's no question about that. We've reached that point in our existence. I was suggesting that perhaps there was something else of value that we had not yet dealt with. I don't know what it is. But I do know that if we continue to go along the line that we're going on of trying to build a factory, trying to do this is all really very nice, very well-meaning, and it works on a small level, but it's not going to change the basic problem. We're again finding ourselves in the same problem, each panel successively. We don't escape this problem. The house has many mansions, but they're all built the same way. And we're still looking at things from a substructure and from a basic structure that will not bend. We can only see the world in terms of the way that we were taught how to see the world. And we're still not trying to figure out any other substructure to build on.
If cultures are more than just folklore, which we can reasonably tolerate, we have to examine one underlying very important and difficult assumption indeed, which has also direct consequences for economy. If 100 years ago, hardly anybody in this city probably would have doubted that, well, Christianity is universal, or at least God, in the most broader sense, is universal value. We are now accepting that science is universal. And this is a very difficult question to answer. But I think we should put the question. And I am for one inclined to think that science is neither neutral, can be positive or negative, nor universal. And thus, if we want to have an economy valid for the entire world, even this scientific structure has to be called into question in the most candid way of the way. You see, 2 and 2 are 4 only when 2 and 2 mean nothing. Because the moment that I apply, the thing becomes problematic. So that this is an underlying assumption. This doesn't mean that science is not valid. This doesn't mean that science has not a place to, a role to perform. But perhaps in this globality we are all asking for, we may be starting with parameters which are not fit to the immensity of the problem which confronts all of us. Fortunately, none of us have solutions. But if we put the finger on the real problems, we may be much more realistic in approaching them, not only with more respect, we all have respect, but with much more realism.
Thank you.
Hear, hear. We only have a little part of the total reality, and the total, or the totality of real science is far and far bigger than we can cover with a little teeny-weeny bit of our present science. That opens also the gate to appreciate wisdom and maybe science and other cultures which are far behind our own capacity to imagine. And that also might diminish our own arrogance, because we walk in and say, well, I'll explain you how atomic energy works. We don't understand anything about atomic energy. We think we understand something about it.
So this mania for development, which we've exported to the whole world, which has brought in its train secular education, technological progress, modern economic systems, has destabilized the whole world economy and destabilized most societies in the world as well. So in a sense we've created an unstable situation throughout the world. It's difficult to see quite how to get back to a more stable one. I mean, we've unleashed forces which we now don't understand, and the mechanistic worldview is part of that unleashing process. It's given people permission to think of the earth as just something to be used for monetary gain. And it's difficult to change attitudes back again. What it does is creates a split in us, and it creates a split all around the world.
Do you not think that we adopt, us Westerners, a very patronizing attitude towards the nations we call the third world, instead of putting our own countries in order first, and then, like the phrase of the Jesuits, you know, do as I say, not as I do, and then they would do as we do, not as we say. Let's put our own houses in order first.
I think that what you said is absolutely correct, and I think that's what Weiner's trying to say all the time. And I would suggest that we understand the real meaning of the name of our symposium. Art means science and spirituality in a changing economy, and trying to go beyond ideology. Ideology is something that is absent here. That's why I said in the very beginning, I don't think any of the existing systems is exactly adequate for the future. That's why we should shed our ideology, say, yeah, capitalism is good for this, Tibetan mind is good for that, and so on and so on. Let everybody find his own way in that, and let's go beyond ideology.
I don't think that science is universal. I think the language of science might be universal. The models that science develops are universal. But science itself, I think, is not universal. What is universal, I think, is the natural reality. And what science tries to do, and I think also art and economy, maybe not spirituality, is to perceive reality, to develop a model which is a perception of reality, but it is not the reality.
You know very well, just as I do, that what gets done is what gets funded. If you don't get funding, you don't do research, and funding, of course, is determined by values, and most of it is military. You know, in the United States, 76%. And to change this exponential growth of science is very well possible and very easy just by changing the funding structure and making it more democratic, and that's what we'll have to do.
Human mankind, and especially people in the economic sector, are so intelligent that they have exchanged the soldiers from the war and pre-war and put in its place the debt of the foreign countries, the developing countries. They don't need anymore the armory. They don't need anymore to send in their own people to get killed in uprisings. But what they've done, they've found out a system whereby you can put money in a certain country and then blackmail them.
I think what he said is quite true. That is to say that there are many other forms of pressure being made by Western countries on developing countries. Bribery. Corruption. It's one of the most important things which makes the people who work the world working for the time being. It's quite true. It's one of the major problems, and this is why I think it's very important that we bring more ethics in our life.
We're all talking in great circles about how to sound nice, but what about existential subjective imperative? And it's something that formed almost every single person on this panel, from Genet to Sartre. And if we would determine this gentleman's question could be answered in terms of existential imperative, a real subjective existential imperative, if we were capable of trying to determine what the fuck it is we really want. I'm still a bit appalled at the fact that with all the good intentions, we're still talking about structures that, if we were honest with ourselves, don't work. Our problem is we still do not try to discuss a structure that might be inherently different, Western or otherwise. It makes no difference, and I don't mean to look for wisdom in any other structure. I mean to look essentially why we are not happy with this structure and just change it, no longer decorate it. Stop painting the walls for a while. Stop trying to make the house maintain enough of a gezellig, coziness to keep your kids home. They're going to run away anyhow. They're supposed to. Maybe we're supposed to understand this. Maybe the whole basis of all of our productivity is to end an entropy that might be an internal, inherent part of our existence. We live, we're born, we die. That's entropic. Why not just accept the basic entropy of the society, not attempt to stop the pendulum from going? Until you do that, we're not having a conference about art meets science and spirituality and a changing economy. We're having a sort of a power meeting of how the economy can help sustain art, spirituality, and science.
Very good. Very good.
And that's not the purpose.
In the most general terms, I would say a hope for and faith in the coming of the kingdom of heaven on earth, nothing less than that. Now, if the weekday worldview, which is usually mechanistic for most people, were replaced by a worldview in which we see the world as alive, as part, a holistic, I would say even animistic worldview of the whole cosmos as alive, as the earth is alive, ecosystems as alive, a view that I think would fit with my own ideas and those of David Bohm and various other contemporary scientists. It's difficult to say how quickly it would change our institutions, because after all we've got huge institutions of banking, commerce, economics, development set up, which won't immediately respond to a change in worldview. It will involve breaking whole habits of social expectation and economic activity and so on before we begin to see the change coming about. You see, I think there are further bridges have to be made. I don't think a change in worldview by itself will immediately change what's going on in the world.
Tibetan Buddhism is quite unique, because in Tibetan Buddhism every aspect of life is part of the whole vision. The art and science, everything is part of the same vision. What we speak of is the most important is the view. That's the most important is the wisdom, the understanding. That everything is a skillful means, different means. And there are, for example, different people with different abilities, different ways of bringing about this means. So it is seen from that perspective. So I think, you see, if these various people from the different fields are brought together and are able to see this overall vision, then you see, I think there will be, you know, I think it's a great benefit, really. Sometimes it's very difficult to say. The effect may not be seen immediately. The effect may be even something that perhaps you would not know, I would not know, because we don't know what really goes on. So it takes much more greater repercussion. You see, like when you throw a little pebble into a little pond, you see the ripples. It goes so far.
I think that the very fact that connections are being made between art, science, economics, and other realms is important, and it may help to create a context in which the changes will happen. I doubt if the changes would happen right there at the conference. One can very rarely program the emergence of new syntheses or new paradigms. One can create conditions that might help them to happen. And my own view, though, is that we won't have a new world order just through art, science, and economics, which are secular activities, and all of them can be pursued in the absence of any sense of a mythic and a spiritual dimension of things. So I think that the only chance for new integration will be one that includes the spiritual and the mythological.